right, welcome back. We're going to continue on here with the Atlantic slave trade. In part one, we basically introduced why the slave trade took place. We talked about how a lot of the crops needed in the Americas were very labor intensive, and we looked at specifically Africans capturing other Africans for gold and for guns. To make this all happen. We had talked about how only 4% of the slaves transported to the Americas made it to what would become the United States. In this point, we're going to start looking at the actual voyage itself, and we'll look at the consequences of the slave trade. So, we need to talk about the triangle trade. The whole reason any of this happened was, of course, for money. But you try to be as profitable as you can and as efficient as possible. So we're going to look at the triangle trade. When we talk about Europeans, we're kind of looking at the British. Certainly Spain and Portugal here are part of this as well. But what you would do is you would sail south down to Africa. You would trade for your Africans or capture your Africans. And then you would sail west over to the Americas. You would then sell your Africans and make money, and then you would load up on goods like tobacco and cotton and different things that North America or Central America offered that Europeans didn't have back home. And then you would travel back home and you would sell those goods. You would make money on several of these stops, and when you're done, what you see here is basically a triangle. So we're going to talk about the triangle trade or triangular trade. So transported Africans were part of the triangle trade. So let's kind of put this on paper here. Europeans traveled south to Africa to capture or trade for slaves. That's side one of your triangle. Like I said there, you would load your ships up. I mean, you tried to load as many slaves as you could on your ship. You gave no consideration to comfort, bathrooms, anything like that. It was all about cargo. How much cargo could you fit on your ship? You didn't look at these people as humans, which is what really makes this such a sad and terrible story. Then the next part of your voyage is Europeans transported captured Africans across the ocean to the Americas. That becomes side two of your triangle. And it's there you unloaded your Africans, you auctioned them off, you sold them, made a lot of money in the process. You would then buy more goods there in the Americas, and of course then part three, after you loaded up on buying sugar and coffee and tobacco, you would sail back to Europe and you would sell those goods back home. So you can make a lot of money in the Atlantic slave trade. Now, the voyage that actually brought captured Africans across the ocean was called the Middle Passage. I'm going to go ahead and say the Middle Passage might be the worst thing that's ever happened to humanity. You know, when we get to the Holocaust at the end of this semester, I'm going to talk about how I think Auschwitz may have been one of the worst places that ever exist in the history of humanity. But you want to talk about events, and certainly it's not a singular event because the Middle Passage was a journey taken by likely hundreds and hundreds of ships transporting millions and millions of Africans. But the idea itself may be the worst thing that's ever happened to humanity. The Middle Passage was, cramming as many Africans as you could on those ships, chaining them together. Imagine being on a ship for weeks, maybe even a couple of months, and not being able to move, having no bathroom breaks, getting very, very little food. You're rolling around in your own filth, in your own feces. You're rolling around in other people's feces. There was a percentage of Africans that died on these voyages. In the end, it would be millions that died on these voyages. It was awful, awful stuff. Oftentimes, if the Africans didn't do what they were asked, they were whipped and beaten aboard these ships. Some were killed in the process, but here's the deal. The Europeans didn't want to kill Africans. If some of them died, they didn't really bat an eye to it. They weren't really sad, but of course, it's like buying a carton of eggs from the store. If you lose one or two on the way, you're not going to be really sad, but it is product that you're losing. And I say that with a heavy heart because I don't mean to think of people as products, but that's the way the Europeans did. So of course, you were surrounded by malnutrition, you were surrounded by disease and human feces on these voyages. And there was literally not a bathroom for the Africans to use. You had to go right there. So you can imagine the smell in these ships would have been just the most appalling smell you could imagine. Just horrible, horrible stuff. So roughly 20% perished on these voyages, and that is a high number. Again, it's like taking your eggs home and losing two and a half eggs from a carton of a dozen. You still have plenty of eggs to make your cake or to make breakfast. In this case, you still have plenty of Africans to make money on. But the idea was if we can pack in, let's say, 1,000 Africans on one voyage, knowing we're going to maybe lose 200 of them, we're still going to make a lot of money from the 800 that are alive. So they were willing to sacrifice some to certainly make money off the ones that were left. And that's a really, really sad economic plan when you're talking about trafficking human people. Here's some images. You can see this is head to toe, head to toe, head to toe, people crammed into these ships. You can see here different decks that you would use. I mean, you would have no room to maneuver. You can imagine all the sores and how terrible this would be for your muscles. Sometimes you were taken above the ship just to get a little bit of air and just a little bit of exercise, but you're talking about minutes a day. So the middle passage just really would be one of the worst things that any human would have to go through. And the terrible analogy that I make here with the Holocaust, saying that Auschwitz might be the worst place that's ever existed. There's some, gosh, I hate saying this, but there's some solace in the idea that a lot of people who were taken to Auschwitz were killed immediately, that they didn't have to suffer. I'm not thrilled about saying that, but here, at least in the middle passage, these people had to suffer through this. You were alive and you were meant to stay alive so that you could be ripped away from your family and spend the rest of your life working with no rights and no freedom. Here's another image, kind of the coffin position, head to toe, head to toe. You can imagine again what happens when these people have to go to the bathroom. Just a terrible, terrible condition. Here's just another map, very similar to the one we already looked at, looking at from the Ivory Gold coast of Africa, the west coast of Africa, how most of the Africans were taken over here to Brazil, to the West Indies here in Central America, and of course into North America, the United States. Now, we'll see this in Amistad, African captives thrown overboard. Sometimes sharks followed the slave ships because as those Africans, that 20% that did die, you didn't keep them, you threw them overboard. If people seemed really, really weak and that they were about to die, you would stop feeding them, and then you would throw them overboard when they died. So you can imagine the delight of the sharks as people are just becoming meals for them. Slavery in the Americas. Well, as soon as you were brought to the Americas, you were auctioned off as property. Didn't matter if your wife was with you or your kids were with you. A lot of times that did happen. You were ripped away from your family to the highest bidder. So families were broken up and sold to different buyers. Most of the workers worked in mines or fields, sometimes as domestic servants. Sometimes you could be butlers or cooks, things like that. And then you would certainly enjoy a slightly higher standard of living because it would be a lot better to work in the household rather than out in the hot fields all day. But regardless, you were all given very little food and lived in very small, dreary huts. There were very few slave owners that cared for their slaves. There are stories of the ones that did, that took a little bit better care of their slaves, but they're certainly in the minority. You were forced to work long hours and suffered beatings. Certainly, if you didn't work the way your slave master wanted you to, didn't work hard enough or long enough, or if you even tried to escape or anything else, you would be beaten and whipped, and that would be made very, very public, so all the other slaves would see it and think twice about doing the same thing. Slavery was a lifelong condition, and it was hereditary as well, because in these slave huts, people did get married, they did have kids, and so if you were born as as a child to two slaves, you were basically born a slave, and you were going to grow up a slave. I mean, there was nowhere else for you to go, so it could definitely be a hereditary condition. Africans often used music and stories of their ancestors as modes of survival. I mean, you had to rely on one another, you had to rely on your culture to get you through it. But there were ways to resist. Um, Number one, if you could break your tool, not necessarily snapping your hoe or your shovel or whatever you were using in half, but finding ways for it to break, and that might allow you a short reprieve, and as they find a different job for you, or certainly find another tool for you to use. You could walk the thin line of how slowly could you work without getting beaten. Obviously, the slower you worked, the less energy you had to have in order to do so. But in the end, you certainly could get in a lot of trouble if you were caught. You could run away, and slaves did do this. Obviously, if you got caught, it could lead to you being hanged. You could be beaten, and obviously, you would, if one of those two things didn't happen, you would certainly be thrown back in to your plantation where you were working. Most of these slaves were branded. I do think I have a slide of that coming up here, but you were branded just like cattle are branded. And think about that analogy for a minute. But you were branded so they knew what plantation you were coming from. Now, uprisings and revolts did occur. It was incredibly rare as well. We're going to see a little bit of this in the film Amistad that we're building up to here. But sometimes there were cases where the slaves did fight back. But it was very difficult to do this, especially if your slave masters had guns and you were in unfamiliar territory. A couple images for you. Here's just a flyer selling Africans. Of course, Negroes would be one of the words that was used. Niggers, of course, would be the really derogatory word that was used. But this is basically saying, hey, come here at this point in time. We've got 29 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls. We're trying to sell. And here's an auction. You would clean them up, put them up on sort of a little stage, and you'd auction them off. Auction them off as if they were, a piece of property. Here's another picture of the inspection and sale. People would come check them out, check their teeth, check and see how well, if they were healthy, check their muscles, things like that. Here's the brands. So you'd heat these up and you would brand these to your slave's skin. It would be incredibly painful and it would never go away. So you would know what plantation those slaves came from. If you didn't follow orders, you would get 30 lashes. The whip would actually tear into your skin, certainly leaving you wide open for infection and bleeding out. It rarely killed you unless you lost a lot of blood, and it would leave you scarred just like this. So you can imagine how incredibly painful that would be. So we'll finish here with the consequences of the slave trade. These are things that changed as a result of the slave trade taking place. Obviously, the types of slaves that were desired were the ones that could work the best. So in the end, numerous cultures lost generations of their fittest members. I mean, you're taking the strongest, best workers, a lot of them being men, out of these gene pools, and that's certainly going to have an effect on future generations. We've already mentioned that African families are torn apart, and this happened regularly over and over and over again. Husbands and wives never seeing each other again, children never seeing their parents again. Really, really awful stuff. We saw with the trading for Africans that this is going to introduce guns to the African continent, something they really didn't have prior to this. There's no doubt that the free labor that Africans provided contributed greatly to the economic power of the Americas. America got a lot of free labor out of this, and it certainly helped the South here in the United States immensely to become wealthy, for at least for certain families and certain people. So we owe a lot of our economic power to this horrible, horrible event. It brought African culture to the Americas. Art, music, religion, and food. Certainly the obvious here is it brought Africans to the continent. We'll talk about that in a second here, but along with that comes their culture. So, because of that, we have a large African American population in the Americas today. This would not exist. Indigenous uh, black people, and I don't, it's funny, sometimes we don't feel comfortable using that term, especially white people, but it is a very appropriate term if you're describing a group of people. Um, you didn't have black people here in the Americas, just like there weren't white people here prior to Columbus finding North and South America. I mean, they were all Native Americans, and so it is definitely going to change the um, ethnic identity of the continent. And then, of course, you get mixed races. I mean, just like we saw mestizo, we saw Spanish population mixing with native population. Of course, you're going to have white population mixing with black population. So we do have mixed races due to forced population here on the continent. And that's going to bring us to Amistad. My classes, this is where we always go with this. We're going to watch Amistad, which is a very, very famous true story of about a rebellion aboard a slave ship called La Amistad and the events that happened afterwards. So we're going to take a look at that here next in my class. All right, to wrap up our lecture here on the Atlantic slave trade, let's revisit our constructive response question. Question simply says, describe the Atlantic slave trade and its effects. Well, I think part of the thing we need to do here is we need to define the slave trade, and there's a number of ways we could do that, but very simply we could say it was the buying and selling of Africans for use as free labor in the Americas. Really at its heart, that was the Atlantic slave trade. But what we want to do with that is we want to incorporate some key concepts. For example, we want to include the triangle trade. The triangle trade really was the reason the slave trade existed in the first place. So Europeans would leave Europe, travel south down to Africa, where they would buy and trade for Africans. That's the first side of our triangle. Then they would load up the Africans on these ships, and they would pack them in like sardines. They were very, very tightly packed in there. In terrible conditions, without bathrooms, with very little food, and they would travel across the Atlantic Ocean. That was the Middle Passage. We definitely want to make sure that we mention the Middle Passage in this answer here, but that's the second side of our triangle. So once they reach the Americas, they are auctioned off. Oftentimes families are split apart. And the Europeans then load up on other goods that they can get in the Americas, like tobacco and cotton and things like that. And then they head back from the Americas over to Europe to sell those goods back at home, making our third side of our triangle. So we definitely want to talk about the Middle Passage. We definitely want to talk about the triangle trade. But ultimately, the effects. We talked about the consequences, one of the last slides in our PowerPoint. Families were broken up. Labor contributed greatly to the economic power of the Americas. Led to mixed races in America, led to a higher African American population in the Americas. Certainly, African tribes were stripped of their fittest members, created conflict, and introduced guns into the African continent. So we've got a whole long list there of effects of this slave trade. Certainly, worst part of it is some of these people were slaves for life, and their children were born as slaves. We can't overestimate the atrocity that would be in the lack of freedom. So it really is one of the worst things that ever happened. It's something that should have never happened, but it did, and we have to learn from it. We have to move on and make sure that we don't forget and then repeat some of these things that have happened in the past. So that should do it for us here today. I hope you learned something, and we'll see you next time.